Dr. Kime, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to be here in your house, and thank you for joining breakfast at Küsnacht.
It's a pleasure.
I would like to start, as always, with a very simple question. Who was Carl Gustav Jung?
I'm not sure I could answer that, because I think the only way to answer that would be if you actually knew him, and I don't presume to know anything about the man himself other than what's been written about him, and I don't really think that that is enough to presume to any personal knowledge. So I think the best answer to that is that I don't know. I don't know who he was, and I'm not sure for people who are studying his work or claim to be following his work that it matters very much who he was. I think that it's far more important to spend one's time having an understanding of what he said and what he thought. Mixing those two things up, who he was and who he was in his writings, I think is the source of a lot of errors. And I think people can get a bit carried away with assumptions about what he thought based on their assumptions about who he was. So I like to keep those two things separate. So in terms of who he was as a thinker or as a historical figure, that's a different question, and I think that is a bit easier to answer. And I would say that my impression of that is that he is a relatively unique character in history of Western thought. He's a very specific and important type of polyglot that we very rarely see. But also he was somebody who, while having a particular, or following a line of a particular theory he was developing, was also extremely sensitive to the idea that theory is somewhat brutal and that one shouldn't impose it when one's theory is supposed to inform a certain type of practice. So I take him as a sort of a pioneer of a type of psychology which advocates a theoretically informed psychological approach rather than a theoretical psychological approach. I don't like to hypothesize about the kind of man he was, precisely because I think that leads to a certain type of mysticism and hero worship, which I think he would have been horrified, well, was in fact by some of his extant quotes, was horrified by. You know, the famous quote, "Thank God I'm young and not a Jungian," and such quotes. I think that he's quite a character enough in his writings than we have to augment that with a certain type of excitement about his character in real life, which, let's face it, the practicing body of Jungians don't know anything about that, and I think it's best we stick to the books rather than the fragmentary pieces of historical information about him. So I think I'm going back on what I said now. I think basically I'm going back to the beginning and saying I don't know. I don't know who he was, and I don't think for practicing Jungians it matters very much.
What do you think is relevance, or the relevance of his work in the 21st century?
Now that's a terribly difficult question, because it depends which part of his work. I think one shouldn't rush, because one likes Jung or has read Jung or practices Jungian psychotherapy or is enthusiastic about certain of his ideas. I don't think one should rush to an idea of Jung which is rather primitive in its granularity, so that Jung is just marvellous and relevant to everything or is not relevant to anything. His work is quite voluminous, has many different aspects, and so it depends very much on which aspect of his work one's thinking of. For example, if you take some of his more traditionally empirical early works, sort of volume 2, around volume 2, volume 3, and then also the synchronicity pieces, where he sort of dabbles in what would now be considered sort of empirical psychology. That that has very little relevance now, I would say, because the methods he was using would not pass muster today by any standards at all. And so, which isn't to say that the concepts are not particularly relevant, but the methods that he used were of a time. And so that aspect doesn't really carry very well into the 20th, 21st centuries. The relevance of the content of his ideas is a different matter, and it's a very difficult one, because while there's some aspects which are in some respects a little bit romantic about his views, it's absolutely clear that there are certain timeless fundamentals that he was trying to get at which couldn't possibly not be relevant at any time, because they're completely atemporal. And in his best moments, when he's talking about archetypes, he detemporalizes them completely, partly due to his sort of vaguely Kantian proclivities, and that renders them relatively timeless in terms of their application. And that opens up a whole area of study which is quite alive today. However, it is debatable. I think it's debatable. I know it's not particularly debatable in mainstream Jungianism, but I think it's debatable how relevant a lot of the use to which he put mythology is today. Because there is a thread, I believe, of a fairly regressive longing for the past in there that you can credibly read into it, which I think there are good reasons that doesn't have as much a place today than one might imagine. And I do see a lot of work in mainstream Jungianism, in my view, rather desperately trying to hold and prove that these threads are still relevant today, when in fact I think there's good reason to think that they're not. But the way in which they're not is another question entirely. It's not that they're not relevant because it's just old-fashioned and it's outdated, and that's far too simplistic. It's the particular intentions that Jung had in bringing mythology to the fore as a solution to problems. I think that can be called into question today, but it requires quite a lot of philosophical analysis to understand the reasons why that's the case. So I would say that in general, Jung's approach to psychology could never fail to be relevant at any time in history, because the thing that drew me to Jung in the first place was one sentence in, I forget which volume, but I never forgot this. It was the first sentence of Jung's I ever remembered, and it was the one that still guides my particular admiration for him, which was that you learn a lot of theory and you remember a lot of particular things that you studied, and then when the patient walks into the consulting room, you forget all about it. And that is so fundamentally correct. It's so fundamentally correct an attitude towards the role of theory. It's not a dismissal of theory at all. It's a knowledge that theory has to be absorbed into the structure of one's approach and then forgotten. But it's not entirely forgotten. It becomes the fabric of how you work. But it's not something you apply. And that is a terribly deep insight which has to be learned over and over and over again every single time a patient does in fact walk into the room. And so the relevance of that and how that particular insight plays itself out in Jung's work over and over again, it couldn't be more relevant, because it is the fundamental structure of what it is to do psychology.
This is interesting, because this is a question I asked to my supervisor. We will talk about him in a few minutes. Once I asked him, how do you put together theory and practice? And he said, well, are two completely different and separate things. One thing is theory, but when I'm in front of my patients, there is much more. It's the rapport, the relationship, the intuition, the dreams they bring. So it's something that gets enlarged by the relationship with a human being.
That's true, but the way in which it is enlarged. It has to be enlarged by a mind that has absorbed theory.
Structure even.
Yes, because theory is one does need training in structure so that one's approach is structured. It doesn't necessarily have to be structured on any particular lines. I'm not a particular adherent of the idea that certain theories are correct and certain other theories are false. I don't think it matters that much. But one does need some structure, and that's a very, very important question in psychology. How much structure is necessary in order to practice psychotherapy, for example, or psychoanalysis? And now my view of this is that a lot. You need a lot of structure. And it's a very subtle and very specific, very special and unique type of structure. But it's not it's not structure in the sense that it's a set of rules you apply when a patient walks into a room. And there's obviously, we all know there's a lot of that in mainstream psychology where the patient says this, you say this, and there's certain approaches have literal check sheets and of things to ask and reply, and if somebody has this kind of affect, you have this kind of reply, and this sort of thing. This is utterly unpsychological, as far as I'm concerned. It's completely against what Jung advocated anyway. One does need structure, but it mustn't be structure as expressed in content. It must be real structure, i.e. its form must be structural. It mustn't be reified in content. So, the most egregious examples are when people will say, well, the patient says this to me, and then I say to them, well, that's a good example of transference, or this is that's a classic example of projection, or whatever. This sort of it's almost like a sort of psychological bingo where you say, there we are, yes, that's that theoretical thing I've just seen, and this is the correct theoretical response, or there's these, or the awful idea of differential diagnosis, the awful aspect of differential diagnosis is that we've sophisticated our idea of the relationship between theory and practice simply by expanding the number of possible theoretical responses. So we say, so the patient says this, and I say, well, that means this, or perhaps this, or perhaps this. That theoretically, that doesn't make any difference at all. That doesn't make it any more psychological just because you now have a logical disjunction of potential theoretical responses. That doesn't mean anything. You still have this hard and fast distinction between theory and practice. You still have this idea that there's theory that can be applied, and you're just disguising it by saying that there's potentially multiple theories that can be applied. All you're saying is that, well, there's theory, but there's also ignorance. Well, yes, of course there is. I mean, so what? So, the distinction between theory and practice is, Jung very much understood that distinction is not entirely a legitimate distinction. And I think that's one of his, if not, for me, his greatest strength.
When did you first encounter Jung's theory, and when or how did you decide to train to become a Jungian psychoanalyst?
I'm afraid this is probably going to sound a little bit less fateful, as a lot of people like to cast their initial encounters, because I don't really believe that those fateful encounters are generally very accurate. I think they're generally historical reconstructions, but this is... What happened for me was I was on holiday in Canada with a friend of mine a long time ago as a young man, and I had obviously at that point I'd done a degree in philosophy. I read a lot of philosophy and bits and pieces of psychoanalysis, and we went camping in the middle of nowhere in Canada, like you can in Canada when you're really in the middle of absolutely nowhere, what I had to do, I had to climb a tree and hang the packs away from bears in the tree, and this is what you have to do when you're in the middle of the nowhere. And I jumped out of the tree after hanging the packs up and badly sprained my ankle, and we were in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and my ankle went black and swelled up, and it was very unpleasant, and we had to row out of the middle of nowhere and then drive to a hospital in Sault Ste. Marie, I think it was, in Canada, and they said, you've torn a ligament or something. And so then the whole day was cancelled, and we had to drive back across hundreds of kilometres of Canadian wilderness for like 2 days to get back where my friend was living. I was in a bit of pain. I needed to pass the time in the car. We stopped at a sort of roadside mall thing, and there was a bookshop there. And I went in, and I was just looking. I thought, it's a very long journey. I'm in a bit of pain. I need something to read. So I looked on the bookshelf, and I'd been meaning to look at Jung. The name was kicking around. I knew I was going to investigate it at some point. And I found volume 12, Psychology and Alchemy, on the shelf. I thought, well, that'll do. It's by Jung. It's a book.
An easy one.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a book. And so I, fortunately, because I was in Canada, it turned out to be the Princeton, not the Routledge ones, which are available in the UK. So I ended up having to go through the collected works in the Princeton volumes, which I can only get, not in the UK, because Routledge have the rights in the UK, which is a huge pain. And so I read Psychology and Alchemy while I was in the car. And I thought, oh, this is quite good. I think I'll read all of this. And it sort of caught my attention partly because of his approach to, the aforementioned approach about his notions of theory, which I'd already been thinking for a while and I was very keen on. And because it seemed to me to be a very good vocabulary in which I've been thinking along psychological and philosophical lines and wondering what to do with this sort of reading and studies for quite a while, and this I looked at this and I thought, well, here's a vocabulary that I understand this vocabulary and I can use this vocabulary, and it's important to have a vocabulary in order which to speak about things that you're interested in. And before that I didn't really know how to frame the kind of thoughts that I'd been having. So this frame sort of naturally fit, and I thought, and it was just good timing really. And so I thought, okay, fine. And so then, I formed of a habit of doing philosophy. I went and got home and read a couple more volumes, and then started at the beginning and went all the way through. And by the time I reached the sort of middle of the collected works, I realised that this was not only an excellent vocabulary, but it was a vocabulary in which you could say very deep and important things, and which, and also that's important for a young man at the time. It provoked a certain amount of admiration for what one's imagination of Jung as a man was. And that's for young, philosophically inclined men. This is sort of important, right? To be able to look up to the person who's the progenitor of certain ideas does matter, because it provides a certain kind of animal level connection with which you can motivate yourself to study and continue. And that sort of worked for me, because I'd read Memory Streams until the middle, and I thought, oh, it seems like a decent, genuine man as well. That's nice, because at that point I'd read Schopenhauer and things like this, and Schopenhauer couldn't really be said to be a decent, genuine man. He was a bit of a swine, and so were a lot of philosophers, and so that's quite typical in philosophy, that you don't really want to know about their personal life because it sort of ruins the impression a lot of the time. But with Jung it sort of didn't. And I thought, well, and that mattered, right? Because part of the content of what Jung's talking about is integration, and the fact that it's not that great having a disconnected intellectual theory when your personality just doesn't reflect any of that at all, right? There's a problem there, right? And he's absolutely correct about that this sort of very, in the sort of colloquial sense, neurotic Western idea of the genius, which actually is another thing that Jung mentions quite explicitly, that the Western idea of genius is very disconnected, right? It's that the Western genius is someone who's absolutely brilliant at one particular thing and almost has to be useless at everything else. Is an absolute swine in their personal life, or is terrible at everything else that isn't their discipline, and that's almost the definition of genius. And his view was, and I think quite rightly, that that's not that impressive. It's not that difficult to neglect everything else apart from one thing and become good at it. That's not very impressive at all. And by that time I'd been teaching in a philosophy department, and I'd seen this in real life, right? And so this really resonated with me, the fact that I knew a lot of people who were relatively high up, and some famous people in philosophy who had published a great deal and were quite well respected in the field, but I knew them as human beings. And I'd go to parties with them and dinner parties and see them on their everyday in their offices, and they were just dreadful people. I mean, and not just dreadful, but infantile, and I mean, just in some cases really awful. Which doesn't really inspire you with the sort of, you know, Socratic idea of philosophy that it inspires and makes good men. It obviously didn't, in my experience. And so here was someone who was recognizing the fact that an integration of different sides of oneself was necessary in order for anything to count as development. And that really mattered to me at the time, because I'd become very disillusioned in philosophy as a result of the people who were in it. And I remember one of those sort of clear moments that you remember in your life. I remember quite vividly I must have been about 25, 26, something like this, maybe a little bit younger, standing outside the Usher Hall concert hall in Edinburgh, where I was studying, and thinking, why do you want to be in philosophy? And I was teaching philosophy at the time and doing my PhD. And I remember there was all those awful moments when you're actually honest with yourself and you never really forget them. And I remember thinking to myself, the reason I want to do it is because it sounds so good. That if you go to a party and someone says, what do you do? And say, I'm a philosopher. It sounds so great. And I thought, my God, that's such a bad reason to do something. And in that moment it broke. My desire to be I was sort of heading for an academic career in philosophy, and at that moment I just thought, no, I'm not doing this.
The same happened to me in sociology. After my master at Manchester and Cambridge, I felt disillusioned because I've been working on Beck, Bauman and Giddens for 3-4 years, especially on Ulrich Beck's concept of individualization. Mm-hmm. And I wrote 2 theses, and I was starting my PhD on that, and I felt something was missing. What was missing actually was the psychological or psychoanalytical bit, which I found in Jung, mm-hmm. and Jung's individuation theory. And this is actually what my PhD is currently about. But between one thing and the other, I needed almost 12 years to let it grow, mm-hmm. or vaporize by itself.
Well, I mean, the problem is in those sort of periods of one's life when identity is forming, it's a terrible thing to give up identity. That you've just been, you've grabbed onto something as an identity, and I certainly did at the time as being, a philosopher. And I count myself as just lucky of having that moment. And those moments are extraordinarily interesting because you remember everything about it. I mean, it was now, like 25 years ago or more. And I remember exactly what I was wearing, where I was standing, what I was looking at, what the weather was like. In that moment, because it's one of those rare moments of actual honesty, where you say, you actually ask yourself, do I actually value this? And you've answered that question, oh yes, many, many times, but you haven't really answered it. You've never really even considered it. You never really asked it. And then just by whatever accident, you're cursed to suddenly actually ask the question, and then you're forced to answer it. And you find out to your horror at the time that the answer is no, and then you have no idea what to do. And so after that, I was sort of casting around for several years, wondering, well, given that identity is not going to work and I can't justify it anymore, what the hell am I going to do? And so when psychology and alchemy happened, I thought, okay, now that here's a vocabulary which doesn't do violence to the thing that I realised that I couldn't really give away at that moment, and it also has a lot of potential, and I feel a reasonable affinity with it. And so, it wasn't the case that I sort of read Jung and fell in love and thought it was more of I always say it was just, I read it and I thought, I understand this vocabulary.
Quite synchronistic what happened to you in Canada.
Well, I have a very particular view on synchronicity, so I'll reserve judgment.
This is a very good point to introduce the work of Wolfgang Giegerich. How did you move, or how did you get closer to Giegerich from Jung? It's quite a jump.
It would be a jump, except for the fact that my background was in philosophy. And so I was used to a certain amount of, I have to say, rigour in the thinking of the kind of people I was reading. And Giegerich, obviously has that, right? There's much more rigour in Giegerich than there is in most modern analytical psychology. And So that's just a sort of natural. I don't through that automatically make the claim that that makes it better or worse. I think it does make it better or worse, but not automatically. But I came upon it. Somewhat against my will, because having a background in philosophy means that you have gone through the process usually of becoming very familiar with certain philosophers, right? Because you can't, as an undergraduate, you can't become familiar with almost anything, right? Because it's just not enough time. I started most of my what I consider philosophical education after I finished my undergraduate in my free time, because that was more conducive to it. And while I was doing my PhD, I'd read all of Schopenhauer, and I was very, very keen on Schopenhauer. And later on, actually, while I was reading Jung, I was still just finishing off Kierkegaard. And they both, as I mentioned earlier, they both really didn't like Hegel. And Schopenhauer more on a personal level, Kierkegaard more on a sort of principle level in terms with how the Hegelianism affected the church in Denmark. But not really having, I read a bit of Hegel by that point, but reading a bit of Hegel means that you haven't read Hegel. It's just, unless you've read everything, there's no point having an opinion. And so I instinctively hated Hegel because Schopenhauer was my hero when I was a younger man, and Kierkegaard was my hero when I was a bit older, and they hated Hegel, so I thought obviously Hegel's an idiot, and therefore I sort of dismissed it. And I vaguely knew that Giegerich was a bit of a Hegelian, so I thought, well, there's no point reading Giegerich obviously because he's a Hegelian, and whatever. But I'd learnt by that time that one's views on particular thinkers and particular positions are almost always just relatively worthless unless you put in the time to actually go through and read, all of the basic works of the person that you think you don't like. Because I'd done that enough times to know that an opinion that, I don't like this thinker or that thinker or this idea or that idea that is not based on that is essentially worthless. I've done it enough times, and I'm utterly convinced of this now. I've done it enough times, and it's been horribly painful enough to have to do that nothing will ever dissuade me from that now. And so it took a couple of years for me to realise that I couldn't hold out this dislike of Hegel anymore, because it was just utterly superficial and ridiculous given the fact that I hadn't read all of Hegel. And I didn't want to, right, because Hegel's famously unpleasant to read. And eventually I made myself do it. And as always happens when one makes oneself do that, you realise you were wrong. Not just a little bit wrong. Usually, it's really surprising to me. You sort of expect normally in the world that if you had an erroneous view about something and then you actually studied it, that you would correct your view a little bit and it would be a little bit more accurate and nuanced. In my experience, that almost never happens. What happens is that you realise you were absolutely and utterly incorrect about it, that you didn't understand anything, and most of the people whose comments you wanted to like because they were justifying your decision not to have to study it were also completely and utterly incorrect. And I've had that experience so many times now, it's a sort of set belief of mine. And I did that with Hegel, and I read all of Hegel, and I realised that I was totally wrong. And so then I went back, and I thought, in the last sort of 100 pages of Science and Logic are sublime in the real Schopenhauerian sense of the word, that it stills the will and makes you, appreciate something colloquially transcendental. And then, so I went, and as a preliminary to that, I had to go and read all of Kant first, because you can't really read Hegel unless you've read Kant and Schopenhauer and other bits and pieces, which was, a lot of work and not very pleasant, a lot of it. And then I went back and looked at Giegerich's Science of Logic and realised that I was completely wrong about him as well, and that actually this was a terribly important analytical psychologist whose views were very sound, very deep, and one of the only credible voices I'd really heard in analytical psychology in modern times. There's a lot of very, I think it's fair to say, vaguely new agey and relatively superficial work that goes on in analytical psychology, and I was so annoyed by it all. Because of my background in philosophy, the philosophical naivety of it was so staggering and embarrassing that it somewhat made me feel somewhat alienated from the field for a number of years. And so, of course, I was relieved to find Giegerich. I thought, oh my God, at least somebody understands that that a lot of this is just, as he puts it, and I concur, amateurish. And that was a great relief to me to find Giegerich. And so I went and read Giegerich, and I think he's probably, to my mind, he's the most important analytical psychologist alive today.
Did it give you additional structure to the structure you found in Jung?
To some extent, yes, but also he replaced some of the structure that's found in Jung because he's absolutely correct that certain aspects of Jung's conception of things, even if you take into consideration the changing conceptions that Jung had over time, some of them are just not quite right. Some of them are, and I don't say that in any sense of that there were mistakes made. I mean, everybody's work that they do in life is unfinished business, and so it's not the case that one can judge anybody for not having said the right thing entirely, because no one has enough time to do that. But given the fact that in Jungian studies in general, a lot of Jung's pronouncements are considered almost as finished products that can now be applied, that's a terrible mistake to make about absolutely anybody's thought on anything. And there's a tremendous tendency in it's not particular to analytical psychology or any field at all to take people's views as final, and then the job of the next generation is simply to apply them and appreciate them. That's a thoroughly incorrect view to take of just about anything. And everybody agrees when you say that, but that's not what they do. It's those. The amount of times you can sit in a lecture at an institute, and people will say something like, we have to, there's certain things, Jung wasn't quite right about this, and people sort of nod and go, yes, of course, but people generally on the whole don't really believe that. When they actually talk about things and consider their own views and particularly do clinical workshops, that's not how they actually act. It's, there's a lot of sort of what would Jung say kind of going on in the background, and so what people talk is cheap, right? When people nod their heads and say, yes, we acknowledge that Jung wasn't the last word in his views of the psyche. That's not how people actually behave a lot of the time, and Giegerich's one of the few people who actually explicitly says, okay, we need to take that seriously, and we need to see what the problems were without, it's not a personal attack. And again, this goes back to this, the distinction between Jung the man and Jung the thinker. It's like one isn't criticising the person to say that some of the things they actually thought were incorrect. They're totally separate, right? It's not related, but they get confused together so that people become rather protective of Jung the figure, which is just a mistake. I mean, it's simply just a mistake. And so Giegerich was one of the best proponents originally of saying, how do we actually take what Jung did and actually move it further and critique it and put it into a framework that respects the best of what he did and tries to better some of the worst of what he did. And that's, I mean, the irony is that's not a really unique thing, because a lot of people have tried to do that, right? And there's been attempts to put Jung in a phenomenological framework, and there's attempts to put Jung in, in the archetypal school framework, and various ways of reconfiguring the view of Jung that it fits somebody else's, the theory that somebody else is excited about. But this is where the crucial difference between normative and descriptive theory comes in, right? And it's a big problem in philosophy, and it's one of the things that I certainly took from philosophy, is that if you don't keep that distinction between normative and descriptive theory, you are risking terrible confusions all the time. It's a big difference between saying, this is what somebody actually said, and this is what somebody should have said. There's a huge difference, right? And very often misunderstandings in academic discourse and psychological discourse can be put down to not keeping those two things straight and switching between them during a conversation. So there are certain lots of books written about how you can see Jung as, for example, a phenomenologist, or this or that particular theoretical bent, or a Wittgensteinian interpretation of Jung, and very often in those books, it's never kept clear whether they're trying to allege that Jung actually was a phenomenologist, secretly or implicitly or whatever, or should be thought of as a phenomenologist, could be thought further to be a phenomenologist, or a Wittgensteinian or whatever, which makes it almost impossible to make any sense of that kind of work, right? And at least Giegerich understood that distinction and was very careful to say, no, and he's very careful in his books. He'll say, I'm now going to describe what I think what Jung was saying, and now I'm going to talk about what I think he should be saying in terms of psychology. And he keeps those two things very, very separate, and that's a rare thing. That's a very, very rare thing, and it's a skill one learns from philosophy, because it's explicit in philosophy. In fact, there's a whole slew of research from the 70s and 80s in epistemology, precisely about just that distinction, the prescriptive versus descriptive, normative versus descriptive theories, and how they interrelate or don't. And he keeps that clear, and if you don't keep that clear, you can't do anything.
Can we look at certain concept?
Mm-hmm.
Giegerich looked in, for example, concept of soul, or what he says, the logic life of soul, even the difference between conscious and unconscious, or does he believe in the unconscious? Is there the unconscious, something called like the unconscious? Meaning, matter, mind, and we could go on looking at God and ego, because there is a difference between Jung and Giegerich on these aspects.
Yeah. Yes. The difference is it depends which part of Jung you're talking about, but the difference is quite subtle in places and not so subtle in others. In fact, that's been the thrust of a lot of Giegerich's work, is to point out the places where the differences are large and where the differences are small, and he's quite exact on that. Jung's notion of the unconscious it depends where in the collected works you look, to what answer you give to what Jung's notion of the unconscious was. I mean, the original version in the Freudian days, which is covered in the collected works, sort of around volume 5-ish, is a rather Freudian sort of view of repressed contents and somewhat reified pseudo-empiricist kind of conceptualizations of it. But after sort of symbols of transformation, it starts to be more sophisticated, and Jung's really wrestling with the problem, which he does to some extent get from Kant, of what is the status of transcendental concepts like the unconscious, because he's sort of given up this idea that it's sort of a reified level of something somewhere, but he's not quite sure what to do with it at that point, because it's a really understandable thing to have to fight with, right? Because the unconscious, that's what we all talk about the unconscious. Now the problem with Romance languages is that definite articles like the are followed by nouns as a general rule, and the unconscious as a noun, it's very difficult to get out of one's mind that it's some sort of thing or some sort of place. Now, of course, again, as I said earlier about when you look at the difference between how people speak and what they actually do when they practice, people, if you say in a lecture, for example, well, the unconscious is obviously not a place, it's not somewhere that things go, everyone will sort of nod and go, yes, of course, of course, of course. But that's exactly how we actually operate when we use the concept to do anything, or when we when we're not nodding in agreement to such a sentence. I mean, it's very difficult not to think like that. Now, when pushed, we don't think it's a real place, but the concept of place is not just a physical thing, right? I mean, the concept of a location. I mean, we can say, we can quite easily and vividly talk about Narnia, the location of Narnia, as being a place where this happens and that happens. And so the edges of Narnia it's not a physical edge, but there are edges, there are, semantic edges to it somewhere. I mean, famously the wardrobe, right? Which isn't a real object either, but it's a concept in that particular world. So the edges of a place don't have to be an actual, GPS coordinates. But if you have a concept of the edges of something, then you have a place. Whether or not it's a physical place or not is not really that relevant. And so we sort of drift into this idea of an unconscious. Well, it's not really a physical place, but it's sort of a place where contents, whatever they are, is another whole topic, right? Go when they disappear from consciousness and this sort of thing. So we have this sort of very reified, what Giegerich would say, positivistic notion of the concept of unconscious as a sort of abstract species of noun. And Jung was wrestling with that a lot, right? I mean, in the sort of early to middle period works about what this was the unconscious, it being a location. And as his work progresses, he moves and more towards an idea that the unconscious of being more like an adjective rather than a noun. It's a characteristic of something rather than the place where it is. It's some kind of property that contents have that makes them unconscious or not. Whether it's something like they're well defined, or they're the categories under which they fall are accurate or blurred or meld into one another, this sort of thing. But it still has this distinction between the contents that have this property and the property. And Giegerich's notion is much more radical than that. Right? It's a fully Hegelian version of this, where the notion of unconscious is not a positive in the Hegelian entity at all. So there is no object-subject distinction with the unconscious. There's no contents-container distinction with the unconscious. So it's much more like it's a process, which it's the name given to a process by which something is moving into consciousness or leaving consciousness, which of course begs the question about what consciousness is, which is just a negative definition as well. So it's a very, very difficult concept to master properly unless you have a certain philosophical background, because you have to give up this idea of a natural way of thinking about it. And this is one thing that Giegerich tries to do a great deal, particularly in the sociological life. He tries to demonstrate this way of thinking about concepts like unconscious and soul and meaning in an unnatural way. And so he'll talk about the unconscious being the process by which unconsciousness is made and dissolved, and this sort of thing where there's this recursive definition, and it's this kind of recursive and reflexive definition which is indicative of a kind of Hegelian dialectic, and it's so alien to our way of thinking, and it requires so much effort to actually get a sense of what that means, that it's one of the reasons why I think Giegerich's work raises such heckles in people, because there's an idea that it's sort of a certain type of obfuscation, or it's a way of getting around being clear about things. But it's not at all. It just requires a certain amount of philosophical background and work. And of course it does. I mean, you're talking about the deepest, most difficult concepts imaginable. You know, you're talking about the relationship of consciousness to itself, its self-reflexive behavior, the fact that it can actually be its own meta-theory, which is astoundingly subtle and complicated ideas. And the notion that you could understand such ideas just by thinking about them in terms of which you think about chairs and tables and things that you learned when you were 5 years old is ridiculous. I mean, it's incredible that we think that to be a physicist you have to learn higher mathematics and geometry and do a lot of hard preliminary work in order to understand the concepts required to do nuclear physics. But we think for psychology it's just a sort of amateurish occupation that we've heard of a few philosophical ideas and we just discuss them over coffee and that's enough to understand these things, which is, I mean, it's astounding how insulting that is to psychology, how little one thinks of the subject one's supposed to be involved in, that one thinks that it requires it doesn't require anywhere near the effort to become an atomic physicist, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable that you can think so little of the subject which you devoted your life to, that all it requires is reading the odd Wikipedia article and reading some kind of small secondary text on Kant or something like this. I mean, there's no reverence for the subject, and there's a certain point at which reverence for a subject means work. That is the form that reverence takes. You can't just have this sort of sentimental feeling, oh, I love psychology, I love analytical psychology. You have to, someone will say, well, prove it, demonstrate that. How does that manifest? And if you say, well, it's just, I just love it. Well, I just love chocolate cake. So what? I mean, prove, you need to do something you need to prove that by actually doing something. And the thing you have to do is understand certain things, understand the fundamental geometry of the philosophy and the concepts that everything rests on in this subject. And if you're not prepared to do that, why are you even bothering with this subject? Why do you value it? I mean, something that's easily obtained and you can just get from a couple of books and then chat about, get all excited about quantum physics and archetypes and self and individuation and just, get a great feeling from it. I mean, where's the reverence for the subject? Where's the duty to the subject? And it has a long philosophical history. I mean, are you saying that, Jung's wide reading of philosophy and history and mythology was just that was just him, that was just his personality. He didn't really need to do that. Of course he needed to do it. And today we just don't think that's necessary. We think we can just absorb some lectures and a few lecture notes and secondary texts. And Giegerich's correct about this, and you can see I get quite annoyed about this because I've always been annoyed about this, and I was very pleased to see Giegerich say the same thing, which was just the amateurism in analytical psychology, given the fact that it's supposed to be, as Nietzsche said, the queen of the sciences, psychology is the queen of the sciences, and the reverence which people claim to hold for it does not reflect in the amount of work they're prepared to humble themselves under in order to actually understand the concepts which are central to it. And that I find tragic and terrifying.
Another aspect of the amateur approach, not only to psychology but to any discipline right now, is the transformation and changes in the university around Europe with the Bologna approach. Very interesting for me to read at the beginning of The End of Meaning and the Birth of Man, when Giegerich quotes Berkeley in saying, one thing is to have opinion, one thing is to think.
Right.
And to me, one possible reading of The End of Meaning, very important Hegelian category, parallels Fukuyama's End of History, also very Hegelian, and actually tries to contrast the naivety of a certain view of liberal democracy spreading around the globe, and again bringing down to meaning.
Mm-hmm.
What is the meaning of what is happening right now? And with this, sounds a little bit like an activist, but I cannot stop thinking of George Bush father speech in front of the Congress on the 11th of September 1989, few months before the Berlin Wall collapsed, and he said there would be a new order based on mutuality and equality, but actually what happened was the invasion of Iraq, so on and so forth, leading to the IS. I wonder whether 2010 End of Meaning, work by Giegerich, is also looking into this concept that goes beyond the meaning, goes beyond the end of history, and actually challenging being naive and being with approximation.
Yes, I mean, but this is something that's actually critical to understand Giegerich, and it's a conversation I've had with quite a lot of analysts that claim not to really understand or like this approach. Is that part of what Giegerich's doing is redefining terms. Right? I mean, that's absolutely clear. His notion of psychology, when he says real psychology or authentic psychology, he doesn't mean what most people mean by psychology. And that's critical. You can't have a sophisticated view of a concept while retaining the validity of every single other view of that concept that there's ever been. You can't do that. Right? It's not possible because they're mutually self-contradictory and some of them are so superficial they can't even stand up under their own weight. So it's you can't do that. The concept of meaning is, I think Giegerich has a very particular view about meaning, is that it's he's very against this idea of individual meanings, which I completely agree with. I think this is partly a cultural and sociological political phenomenon that we're obsessed with having our own individual meaning. And the problem with this is that it's terribly fragmenting. Individual meanings, unfortunately, are not they don't have enough structure to carry anything beyond the individual. But of course, that's precisely what meaning is, as a vehicle, is supposed to do. It's supposed to provide a trans-individual structure that you can use in order to interpret other people and larger events and how your own future is going to play out and the meaning and the ways you act in the future. I mean, it's not just a temporally isolated or a spatially isolated thing. It has to project spatially and temporally in order for the concept of meaning to have any sense at all. And the notion of individual meaning has a very hard time doing that. And but Giegerich's most extreme pronouncements on meaning, which I've heard in some of his lectures, where he'll say, "You don't need it. You just don't need meaning." He said, "What? You don't need it. It's just what do you need it for? There's being reasonable to people and doing."
Actually, the search for meaning is the problem.
Right, but that's the problem. Is in a lot of the modern sense of this, what's meant by meaning is the search for meaning. Right? I mean, it's the meaning of meaning is the striving for meaning, and Giegerich correctly characterizes this as the 0 point of meaning. Right? It's such a tight circle that the striving for meaning is little more than an empty form at this point, because it's irrelevant what meaning it is. I mean, and this is why he gets so angry about that sentence in Jung about what's your truth. He really doesn't like that sentence, quite rightly, because it trivializes the notion of truth to such a degree that, because what you're supposed to be doing is saying, right, we know we've got this notion of truth we've had since the sort of pre-Socratics and this in the Western Hemisphere anyway, and not just in Eastern philosophy. You have this sort of big notions of truth which do a lot of work, and the machinery of truth is a cosmological machinery, right? In many respects, it governs the movements of everything, and the gods and the earth, and they're supposed to do a huge amount of work. It's everything, and then you say, well, wouldn't it be great if we all just had that? We all just had access to this huge machinery. But of course, what you do when you say, right, I'm going to appropriate this cosmological truth and it's going to be mine. Now, what you've done then, all you've done when you've done that, you haven't taken the cosmological truth and made it yours. What you've done is redefined the notion of truth and brought it down to something so tightly coupled and so tightly reflexive that it basically isn't anything anymore. It's just an empty content. It's an empty desire to have it. You know, the 0 point of individual truth is just the desire to have truth. There's no content left, and you can see that nowadays. That and so then you get an explosion of everybody. In any truth is equal. This is my truth. This is your truth. This is your truth, and they're all as good as anything else because the content's irrelevant now. It doesn't matter what particular thing you're pursuing. It's irrelevant because the only thing that matters is the desire for it. That's all that's left, and that's what Giegerich calls the 0 point of the concept. And it's this strange modern idea that you can take something that's intrinsically not personal and make it personal, and it retains all the characteristics it had when it wasn't personal, but it doesn't. It collapses and disappears. It's redefined. There are certain, and this is because there's this tremendous connection between form and content, which is another one of the reasons why I really like Giegerich, because this is something that I wrote my thesis on before I even heard of Giegerich, and it was something that I was very keen on because of Kant. Because Kant, in his concept of ideas, and the sort of towards the end of the second critique, is this very beautiful idea about structure that Kant really does understand something about the notion of structure at that in the Critique of Pure Reason towards the end. That form and content are not separate entities. They're not separate things, right? There's not a form into which you pour content, and you can change when you change the form of things. It changes the content sometimes, and if you change the content of things, it changes the form of things. So if you take truth, the form of truth as it was historically, for example, mythologically, and you condense it down into the individual and say, now I have truth, just like it was there. Changing the form of that truth from this whole interconnected, complicated, geometrical, cosmological system into this utterly trivial desire for whatever you particularly desire to give you meaning. You don't keep the same content. It's not truth anymore by the same name. You've changed the content of it fundamentally by changing the form, because form and content are not separate. Now, that sentence, form and content are not separate, that requires fleshing out a great deal, because there's a lot. It's a very difficult thing, and this is where we get back to the concept of amateurism in the field. This comes in again, because I think the way I came to an appreciation of that was through forcing myself to read books on mathematical topology and things like this, because without sophisticating one's idea of what form can be, you can't really see how form and content can be connected. You have to look at certain types of geometrical systems where the relationships between the elements of the geometrical system are so complicated and so interrelated that you can't just. It's not just like when you have in like Cartesian coordinate systems where you have an x and a y axis, and when you move along the x-axis, that's totally independent to when you move along the y-axis. When you start to look at sort of certain types of geometries where the axes are not at 90 degrees, right? They're sort of at an angle. Things like this, when it means moving on one direction means you also move along another direction to a certain extent. And when you expand this to multiple dimensions, you start to get a sense of what the word form and shape mean. It's very, very complicated. It's not this simple idea we have of the Euclidean world where I move this chair over there, but it doesn't affect the position of the table or you or anything like this. But in most physical systems that you actually have to analyze and say physics, that's not the case. And in psychology, we are involved with structures that complicated. We're talking about the fundamental connections between form and content all the time, and yet our views about what constitutes form are on the level of like a 14-year-old in mathematics. Right, our understanding of the concepts of form and content are like a teenager, but we're dabbling in a subject where it requires you to be, it requires sophistication of like a postdoctoral maths student, metaphorically speaking, in the understanding of form and content, which is why Giegerich says, you have to have read, he says, and he's absolutely correct, in this day and age, if you're studying psychology and things like this, it's mandatory to know Hegel, and not just Hegel, right? The precursors to Hegel, and bits, and it's mandatory to know what the postmodernists have said. It's mandatory to know something about phenomenology, because the concepts being used in psychology are so embedded in these philosophical histories and are so complicated. You have to be a bit of an expert. You have to be, otherwise you're just talking like a teenager. You don't know anything. It's just, and it's absolutely correct. It's absolutely painful when you see the discussions that go on about, God and the ego and the self, and they require all of us, every part of us, to be engaged in those discussions, because they're some of the deepest concepts that there are. And yet we have this idea that we can discuss the deepest concepts with almost no knowledge about anything. We can just intuit and feel and be very amateurish in reading, and there's no, again, I go back to this, there's no reverence for the field, as that, no, I need to humble myself before the requirements of this field. If you walked into a nuclear physics lab and said, I'd like to be a nuclear physicist, please, and they said, certainly, what are your qualifications? And you say, well, I don't really like mathematics much. I didn't do any differential calculus. It's kind of boring, and I've read a bit, but it's not that exciting. But I really like quantum physics. They would just laugh you out of the room. However, in our field, we feel that anybody can come in and say, I really love it, and it's marvelous. And they go, okay, come in, welcome. You think, well, do you understand what that will do to the field over time? I mean, it will degenerate into, and already has, like a lot of fields in modern times, it degenerates into sort of a sort of amateurish mishmash of bits and pieces of people with sort of bits and fragments of information they get from various places and getting very excited about them, which is all fine, because it's all part and parcel of becoming engaged with the subject. But if it's not coupled with an actual humility and desire to put in the miserable long hours of actually understanding what's required, then it's just chatter. And Giegerich's, he's fighting a good battle in that respect, right? He doesn't just complain about it. He takes great pains to try and explain precisely how the concepts that are required lead in, connect up to Jung, take it a little bit further in places, reconstrue some of the central ideas, and more importantly, make a rigorous, coherent whole out of it. And that's terribly important, because what you often get in analytical psychology is there's no coherent whole. I might have this sort of attitude towards the self, and this sort of attitude towards the unconscious, and this sort of attitude towards complex theory, but there's no coherence. It's just, I sort of feel this about this and this about this, but there's no sort of coherent feeling that brings it together. And the coherent feeling that brings it together is the product of having absorbed theory and structure and information, and then having let it go and just become part of you. And that takes us right back to Jung. That's exactly what Jung said. When I first got interested in Jung, that's what he said. You absorb all this theory, and you read all this stuff, and you do the work, and then when a patient walks in the room, you forget all of it, because if you've done it correctly, it just becomes part of you, and it's structurally part of the feeling tone of what you will do. And that's where it all bottoms out for me in practice anyway. All of this thought and all of the supposedly theoretical work, because people have this sneering idea about theoretical work. If it's done honestly, if it's done enough, quite frankly, enough quantity of it, it saturates into you, and that becomes the feeling tone of how you work with people. And that's where it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be just a piece of paper you read off and say, the theory says this, I now do this. You have to have eaten the piece of paper and swallowed it and digested it, and then it becomes part of you. And that's the feeling tone of how you work. And that's the truth of what Jung used to say. What matters mostly when you work with a patient is not what you know or what you think, but who you are. And your theoretical knowledge is not separate from that. It's not. That's intrinsically part of who you are, if you do it in any credible way.
Thank you, Dr. Kime. It was a great pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.